What if I told you that everything you think you know about Princess Diana's family is a lie? We all know the fairy tale version, the shy, doe-eyed girl who became a princess, the style icon who defined a generation. Everyone points to the Spencers, her aristocratic family, wealthy, respectable, polished. But that's only the story we're meant to believe. Because hidden beneath the name Spencer lies another story, a darker story, a story dripping with blood, betrayal, and forbidden love. A story erased from the official record but alive in the veins of Diana herself. The name you need to remember isn't Spencer, it's Tudor. Yes, that Tudor. The dynasty of Henry VIII. The dynasty of beheaded queens, of shattered vows, of one of the bloodiest reigns in English history. You're probably thinking, that's impossible. After all, history insists the Tudor line ended with Queen Elizabeth I, and officially, that's true. But official history is often the most elaborate lie of all. So if you thought the Tudor story was over, let's reopen it. Our tale doesn't begin in a golden palace or a crowded coronation hall. It begins in the shadows, with a woman history tried to erase. Her name was Mary Tudor. Not Bloody Mary the Queen, but another Mary. Henry VIII's younger sister. A girl whose beauty was legendary across Europe, with fiery red gold hair and eyes that could soften or burn with equal intensity. Henry adored her. He called her his pearl, but pearls can be locked away. In 1514, for political gain, Henry arranged for his 18-year-old sister to marry King Louis XII of France, an old, frail man with failing health. Imagine being her, full of life, passion, and spirit, walking into the icy stone corridors of a foreign court, surrounded by suspicious eyes and whispered rumors. One witness, a guard named Thomas, once told his son that the sound of Mary's laughter was the only warmth in that entire castle. But just 82 days after her wedding, King Louis was dead. Mary was a widow, and more importantly, she was free. But freedom for a princess in the 16th century wasn't really freedom. It was just a pause, a held breath, before her brother the king chose her next husband. And Mary knew Henry would never leave her unattached for long. She wasn't his sister. She was his bargaining chip, his pawn in the endless chess match of European power. But Mary had made a promise, a dangerous, treasonous promise. Before being shipped to France, she had fallen deeply in love with Charles Brandon, Duke of Suffolk, Henry's closest friend, a man whose star was rising fast at court. He wasn't royal, but he had the king's ear. He had Mary's heart. They had sworn that if fate left her a widow, she would choose her second husband for herself. She would choose him. Defying Henry VIII was a death sentence, but for love, some risks were worth taking. When word of Louis's death reached England, Henry moved fast. He dispatched Charles Brandon to France with orders, "Escort my widowed sister home." But there was another order, unspoken yet sharp as a blade. "Do not touch her." Henry knew of their affection, and so, as a sign of trust, he pressed into Charles's hand a heavy gold signet ring. "This," he told him, "is my faith in you. Do not betray it." Imagine Charles on that ship, the spray of the English Channel on his face, the weight of that ring burning in his pocket. He was torn between two loyalties, the king who had given him everything, and the woman who was his only chance at true happiness. To choose Mary was to risk death. To obey Henry was to betray love itself. When Charles arrived at the French court, he found Mary cloaked in mourning, her chambers draped in black velvet. Yet when their eyes met, grief melted into something else. Recognition, desperation, a plea. That night, Mary confronted him. She was no longer a timid girl. She was steel wrapped in silk. "Will you marry me?" she demanded. It wasn't a question. It was an ultimatum. Charles hesitated, warning her of Henry's wrath, of the Tower of London, of the executioner's blade. He reminded her of Edmund de la Pole, a man Henry had executed simply for existing as a distant threat to his throne. But Mary would not bend. "If you do not marry me now," she whispered fiercely, "you will take me back to England, and I will be forced into another marriage, and I will make sure the king knows it was you who refused me. I will tell him you broke his sister's heart." It was a masterstroke of manipulation. She trapped him between two dooms: the king's fury if he married her, or the king's fury if he abandoned her. And so, in a tiny chapel on the outskirts of Paris, with only a trembling old priest and a few frightened servants as witnesses, they defied a king. As Charles slid a borrowed ring onto Mary's finger, a gust of wind burst the chapel doors wide open, snuffing out half the candles and plunging the room into shadows. Father Michel gasped at the omen. They were married, and they were doomed. The journey back to England was a torment. Every groan of the ship's timbers sounded like the axe grinding against the block. Every wave crashing against the hull felt like Henry's fist pounding at the door. They could barely eat. They couldn't sleep. Letter after letter was drafted to the king. Pleas for mercy, offers of jewels and dowry, desperate bargains for their lives. Mary wrote of Henry's love for her, reminding him of promises long ago. Charles wrote to Cardinal Wolsey, Henry's ruthless advisor known as Alter Rex, the other king, begging for his intervention. They offered Henry everything: Mary's dowry, her French jewels, her riches. They would strip themselves bare if it meant survival. But when their ship landed at Dover, the welcome was colder than the sea. No banners, no cheers, only a handful of officials. One of them, Sir Giles, a stout man with fish-like eyes, refused to address Mary as Your Grace. Instead, he looked at Charles with a mix of pity and contempt. The message was clear. You are no longer the king's friend. You are a traitor. They were summoned to London, not as honored guests, but as prisoners. The story of their secret marriage spread like wildfire. By the time they reached the capital, the whole court was buzzing, and at the center of it all was Henry VIII, angrier than he had ever been. For this wasn't just disobedience. It wasn't just betrayal. This was personal. Mary was his sister. Charles was his closest companion. Together, they had made a fool of him in front of Europe, and Henry VIII was not a man who tolerated fools. What awaited them was not a royal reunion. It was judgment. And in Henry's court, judgment was always written in fear. The road from Dover to London should have been a royal procession. Instead, it was a death march. At every stop along the way, Mary and Charles were confined to their quarters. They weren't treated as nobility anymore, but as disgraced prisoners. Servants who once bowed deeply now averted their eyes, whispering behind their hands. One night, a stable boy named Finn, who had once idolized Charles Brandon, slipped a note under their door. It wasn't words, but a crude drawing: the Tower of London, two figures standing on the scaffold. The message was unmistakable. The entire country expected their execution. When they finally arrived in London, there were no crowds waiting, no shouts of welcome, no jeers of contempt, just silence. They were separated immediately. Mary was given beautiful chambers filled with flowers and silver platters of food, but the doors were locked from the outside. It was a cage wrapped in velvet. Charles was led to a bare stone chamber with a single barred window. From it, he could see nothing but a blank inner wall. His world had shrunk to 4 walls and his own gnawing thoughts. This was Henry's first move. Not the axe, not the dungeon, but isolation. He wanted fear to eat them alive from the inside out. For weeks they heard nothing. No judgment, no word of mercy. Just silence. A silence so heavy it became a living thing. Finally, the summons came, but only for Charles. He was marched through the labyrinth of corridors at Greenwich Palace. The walls were hung with tapestries depicting Henry's glorious battles, his royal triumphs. Each scene seemed to mock him as he walked toward his fate. Not the throne room, not a court of nobles, a small private study. And there sat Henry VIII behind a massive oak desk. He wasn't shouting, he wasn't raging. That would have been merciful. Instead, he was calm. He was cleaning his fingernails with a dagger, as if Charles's fate were a casual afterthought. For a full minute, Henry said nothing. He let Charles stand there, sweating through his clothes, heart pounding like a drum. Then, in a voice almost gentle, he spoke. "Charles, my friend, the man I raised from nothing. Did you really think I wouldn't find out?" He gestured to a chair. Charles sat, his knees weak. Henry leaned forward, the dagger still in his hand. "You know the law. To marry a princess, the king's sister, without consent, that is treason. And the punishment for treason is death. The headsman sharpens his axe every morning. Sometimes he asks his wife, 'Who will it be today? I wonder.'" Henry let the words hang in the air like a noose. Then he smiled coldly. "But your head is worth less to me on a spike than your life is in my debt." Henry stood, pacing to the window. "You have not only taken my sister," he said. "You have taken my authority. You have made me a fool before all of Europe. That, Charles, I will never forgive, but I will let you live." Then came the punishment. First, the money. Mary and Charles would repay every penny of her French dowry. They would sign over the income from their estates. They would be noble in name only, but beggars in reality. Second, humiliation. They would be forced to remarry publicly, in front of the entire court, kneeling before Henry to beg forgiveness. Their love story would not be remembered as defiance. It would be displayed as submission. But the final condition was the cruelest of all. "Your children," Henry said, his voice hard as stone. "They will live because I allow it. They will carry no claim, no royal title. They will be watched, their marriages approved by me. You wanted a family of love? You will have it. But it will be a family chained to my crown. You will never be free." Charles left that room broken. He had walked in fearing death. He walked out condemned to something worse, a lifetime of servitude to the man who despised him most. And so Mary and Charles lived on. They had children together, 2 daughters who survived into adulthood, Frances and Eleanor. On the surface, their life seemed enviable. Fine clothes, feasts, a great household. But it was all a performance, a carefully staged play for one audience. Henry VIII. Every decision, every conversation, every guest was monitored. Their steward, Master Croft, appeared loyal, but was in truth the king's spy, sending reports to London every fortnight. Westhorpe Hall, their home, was not a sanctuary. It was a prison with flowers in the windows. And their children grew up in this strange duality, privileged yet haunted. They were granddaughters of a king, nieces of a queen. But they were forbidden to speak of it. Their royal blood was not a blessing. It was a curse. Frances, the eldest daughter, inherited her mother's fire. Proud, strong-willed, unafraid. But she too was trapped in Henry's web. When she came of age, her marriage was not hers to choose. It was arranged by the crown, a careful union meant to control the dangerous Tudor blood running through her veins. She was married to Henry Grey, Marquis of Dorset. A respectable match, but not brilliant, not love. It was a cage with silk bars. Mary and Charles could only watch in agony as their own defiance, their fight for freedom, was denied to their daughter. This was Henry's revenge. It wasn't just on them. It was on their children. Frances and Henry Grey had 3 daughters: Jane, Catherine, and Mary. 3 girls whose blood carried both promise and peril. The most famous, of course, was Jane, the brilliant, bookish child who would one day be known as the 9 Days Queen. By then, Henry VIII was long dead. His sickly son, Edward VI, sat on the throne, controlled by Protestant lords terrified of Henry's Catholic daughter, Mary Tudor, later called Bloody Mary. They needed an alternative heir, someone with Tudor blood, but Protestant faith. And so they turned to Jane Grey. She was only 16. She wanted books, not crowns. She wanted study, not politics. But her parents and their allies had made a deal with the ambitious Duke of Northumberland. Jane would marry his son. Jane would be queen. She wept. She begged. But no one listened. She was swept into the tidal wave of ambition. In July 1553, Jane was proclaimed Queen of England. She was led to the Tower of London, not as a prisoner, but as a monarch. The crown was placed on her head, so heavy she could barely hold it upright. Courtiers bowed, but their smiles were thin, false. Jane was alone. Her lady-in-waiting, Tilly, later recalled that the only time Jane smiled was when reading a letter from her old tutor. For a brief moment, she wasn't a queen. She was just a girl again. But the kingdom did not rally to her. They rallied to Mary Tudor, Henry's eldest daughter, whose claim was undeniable. Within 9 days, Jane's reign was over. Northumberland was executed. Jane, her husband, and her father were arrested. And in one final act of cruelty, Frances, Jane's mother, abandoned her daughter, begging the new Queen Mary for her own life, while leaving Jane to face the block alone. In February 1554, Jane watched from her tower window as her young husband was led to his execution. She saw the cart carry his headless body back past her chambers. A few hours later, it was her turn. 17 years old, calm, dignified. She mounted the scaffold, blindfolded, but when she reached for the block, she couldn't find it. "What shall I do?" she cried out in panic. "Where is it?" A guard guided her hands to the cold wood. And there, in one final, terrible moment, the bloodline born from Mary Tudor and Charles Brandon's forbidden love paid the price. The blade fell. The granddaughter of Henry VIII's sister lay dead. The king's revenge was complete. Or so it seemed. The execution of Lady Jane Grey should have been the end of it. A bloody full stop on a story that had stretched across generations. But bloodlines are stubborn things. Henry VIII may have thought he destroyed Mary Tudor's legacy when Jane's head rolled on the scaffold. But he had forgotten something. Jane had sisters, Catherine and Mary Grey, and their lives would prove that the curse of this bloodline was not finished. It would echo on for centuries. Catherine Grey was everything her studious sister Jane was not. Vivacious, charming, and by all accounts, strikingly beautiful. But she carried the same dangerous inheritance: Tudor blood. Under Queen Elizabeth I, this was lethal. Elizabeth famously refused to marry or name an heir. That meant Catherine, as the senior descendant of Henry VIII's younger sister, was seen by many as the rightful heir presumptive. She was a living alternative to the Queen herself, and Elizabeth, like her father, was paranoid to the core. Catherine knew the danger. She had watched her sister Jane die for the crown she never wanted. She should have stayed quiet, stayed invisible. But she fell in love. His name was Edward Seymour. They married in secret, and when Catherine's pregnancy became impossible to hide, Elizabeth's fury erupted. The Queen did not execute her. No, she chose a punishment crueler. Elizabeth declared Catherine's marriage invalid, her children illegitimate. And then she imprisoned her, moving her from one dreary castle to another, never allowing her to see her husband again. Catherine wasted away, dying at just 27, officially of illness, in truth, of a broken heart. The youngest, Mary Grey, was born with dwarfism and a crooked spine. The court mocked her, treating her as a harmless figure, no threat to anyone. But Mary too carried the Tudor fire, and like her sisters and her great-grandmother before her, she dared to marry for love. Her choice? A man far beneath her station, the Queen's sergeant porter, essentially the palace doorman. Elizabeth was not amused. For this act, Mary too was placed under house arrest, separated from her husband for years. She died in obscurity, another casualty of a curse that began with a secret marriage in France generations earlier. The message from the crown was brutally clear. This bloodline would never be allowed to thrive. It would be imprisoned, stripped, diluted into nothingness. And for a time it worked. Catherine Grey's surviving children were declared illegitimate. They were stripped of their royal proximity, reduced to minor gentry. Their descendants became country squires, parish priests, clergymen's wives. The fiery Tudor blood thinned, forgotten, hidden in the folds of English society. But bloodlines have a way of finding cracks, of surviving in silence. Centuries passed. The Tudors faded into history. The Stuarts rose and fell. The Hanoverians claimed the throne. And the Grey blood, Mary Tudor's blood, slipped quietly into another family name, Spencer. For generations, the Spencers were not royal, not even close. They were wealthy sheep farmers, landowners with a reputation for stability and good business sense. Respectable, but unremarkable. Yet deep in their family tree, hidden like a forgotten inscription on an old locket, ran the blood of Mary Tudor, Charles Brandon, Jane Grey, and Catherine Grey. It survived, waiting. Fast forward to the 20th century. John Spencer, the 8th Earl Spencer, had a daughter, a quiet, shy girl with luminous blue eyes. She worked as a kindergarten assistant, far removed from the glitter of royal life. Her name was Diana Frances Spencer. That middle name, Frances, wasn't chosen at random. It was a family name, passed down from her ancestor Frances Brandon, the daughter of Mary Tudor and Charles Brandon. When Diana married Prince Charles, heir to the British throne, the world called it a fairy tale, a commoner marrying into royalty. But it wasn't that at all. It was history's most ironic twist. The bloodline Henry VIII tried to erase, the family he humiliated, imprisoned, and shamed into obscurity, was now returning to the heart of the monarchy. Through Diana, the blood of Mary Tudor flowed back into the royal line. Through her, the genetic legacy of defiance and tragedy was restored. Her son, Prince William, now heir to the throne, carries that blood. The same blood Henry VIII once deemed unfit for power. The same blood that saw a 17-year-old girl executed on a scaffold. The same blood that queens tried to suppress and kings tried to erase. It is back. It will sit upon the throne. History is rarely a straight line. More often, it's a circle. Mary Tudor's choice to marry for love defied a king. It birthed a bloodline cursed by fear, humiliation, and death. For generations, that line was punished, stripped of status, forced into silence. Yet it endured. And centuries later, it returned, not as a threat lurking in the shadows, but as the mother of a future king. So the next time you look at Princess Diana or at her sons, William and Harry, look deeper, past the Spencers, past the Windsors. See the ghost of another family. See Mary Tudor, the girl who chose love over duty. See Charles Brandon, who risked everything for her. See Lady Jane Grey, the child queen who walked bravely to her death. See Catherine and Mary Grey, who suffered in silence for the love they refused to surrender. Their story did not vanish. It simply waited. Waited until a shy young woman named Diana brought it home. Perhaps this is why Diana touched the world so deeply. She wasn't just the people's princess. She was something older, something darker, something defiant. She was the Tudors' revenge, a bloodline once buried, once broken, standing in the spotlight again. A story that began in a dusty French chapel over 500 years ago, sealed with a secret promise, still lives on in the eyes of a future king.